Welcome to the lecture on Hirarc. At the end of this lecture, the learner should understand the principle of hazard identification, risk assessment, and risk control process. The learner should understand how to conduct a simple risk assessment in the workplace based on the Hirarc method. These are the content of this slide. We will talk about the process of Hirarc, step by step, and follow by the documentation process, and monitoring of control measures. Hirarc stands for hazard identification, risk assessment, and risk characterization. The purposes of conducting Hirarc are mainly, first, to identify all the hazards that may cause harm to employees and others in a workplace, second, to find out what the chances are of those hazards be in contact with the workers, and the possible severity of the outcomes generated from those hazards, and third, to provide an objective assessment to enable employers to plan, introduce, and monitor preventive measures in the workplace, so that the risks are adequately controlled at all times. Hirarc can be carried out in a workplace when there are hazards that appear to pose significant threat to the workers. It can also be done when an employer would like to know whether the existing control measures in his workplace are adequate or not. Hirarc can also be applied in the situations where an employer plans to implement proper corrective or preventive measures, or improve the occupational safety and health systems in the workplace. This is a typical Hirarc work process. It started with classifying work activities in the workplace, then followed by interviewing the representatives from the workplace to understand the work processes. After classifying work activities, we proceed to identify the hazards, then, conduct risk assessment and decide if risk is tolerable, and apply control measures if necessary. Risk assessment is carried out for each hazard by calculating or estimating the likelihood of occurrence and severity of hazard. Risk assessment will eventually characterize and prioritize risks into various categories of importance. Based on the risk characterization result, the assessor should prepare risk control action plan, which should be implemented by the company, and undergo regular review and improvement. Before we start to identify hazards in a workplace, we should explore all work processes that we are going to investigate in the workplace. We can do this by classifying work activities into different categories. Work activities can be classified in accordance with their similarity, such as geographical or physical areas within or outside a workplace premise, stages in production or service process, clearly defined tasks, based on job descriptions, or based on designations. For instance, in a noodle manufacturing factory, we can classify work activities into loading of raw materials, mixing of ingredients, cooking process, cooling process, packing activities, and storage activities. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, your work activities classification should give you a situation where all members in a activity group must share the same risk. Hence, similarity in job tasks and work environment exposure are important factors to decide on work activities classification. After we classify our workers into work activity groups, we proceed to identify the potential hazards present in each group. What is a hazard? Hazard is defined as the source of potential harm. For example, if you see an exposed wire from a wall, it is considered a hazard because the exposed wire may have electrical potential, and may cause electrocution if a worker accidentally touches the wire. Identification refers to the process of recognizing that a hazard exists and defining its characteristics. The aim of hazard identification is to highlight the tasks that pose significant risks to health and safety of employees. Hazards can be classified into physical, chemical, biological, ergonomics and psychosocial hazards. Some people divide hazards into health hazards, safety hazards, and environmental hazards. Types of hazards and their examples are covered in the lecture on Introduction to Occupational Health. How do we identify workplace hazards? Well, you can identify hazards by carrying out workplace inspection. You can investigate accidents, sickness, absenteeism, complaints, and near miss to identify hazards involved in each scenario. You can also identify hazards by carrying out analysis on accident and sickness statistics, performing task safety analysis, job hazard analysis, failure analysis, using predefined checklists, and conducting surveys and audits in a workplace. After we have identified the hazards, we should rate each hazard. How do we rate a hazard? When we identify a hazard, we are interested in the consequences of the hazard. The consequences of a hazard can be negative health effects, financial loss, poor work performance, and so on. In other words, we are interested in the severity of harm that a hazard can impose. Hence, we rate hazard according to the severity of harm that may occur if one is exposed to that particular hazard. And, the severity rating can be based upon an increasing level of severity to an individual's health, the environment, to property, or other outcomes of interest. We use number in the rating to facilitate risk calculation later. This is an example of hazard rating table. We can rate a hazard based on the severity of the hazard can impose, ranging from negligible severity to catastrophic severity. For example, if a hazard that you have identified causes only minor abrasions or injury, that in your opinion, is very minor, you can rate it as negligible and give a value of 1. On the other extreme, if a hazard has a capability to cause multiple fatalities, you can rate it as catastrophic and give a rating of 5. Please take note that this hazard rating table is just an example that a person can use. The table itself can be amended, following a consensus by the top management of a company. In a situation where there is no in-house Hirarc system in place, you can use this table as a guide and start your Hirarc process. Hazard identification is followed by risk assessment. Risk assessment is the overall process of estimating the magnitude of risk and deciding whether the risk is tolerable or acceptable, considering any measures already in place. It is a process of evaluating the risks to safety and health arising from hazards at work. In a broader sense, risk assessment includes the process of hazard identification, followed by exposure assessment, and then risk characterization. To assess the risk, following hazard identification, we have to next assess the exposure. Exposure means the contact of hazard with the worker through all possible route. Assessment is a process of estimating the likelihood of contact with the hazard. Hence, exposure assessment is basically a process of estimating the likelihood of exposure to workplace hazard among the workers. Exposure can occur via inhalation, ingestion, injection, radiation, or direct skin contact. In workplace setting, the commonest route of exposure is via involuntary inhalation. How to assess exposure? We can assess the likelihood of exposure via direct inspection, reviewing a recorded video on work process, interviewing the workers or review work records. We can also have an idea of the extent of exposure using task safety analysis and job hazard analysis. When carry out exposure assessment, we look for the route of entry, the magnitude, frequency, duration of exposure, and people who get exposed, to decide on the likelihood of exposure to the hazard of interest. Exposure can be rated based on an assessor's opinion on likelihood of exposure, or more objectively based on the actual documentation of duration or frequency of exposure. We use numerical values to rate the likelihood of exposure and to calculate the risk later. This is an example on exposure rating table. We can give numerical rating ranging from 1 to 5 to match to the likelihood of exposure from inconceivable or negligible, to highly likely. The likelihood phrases should be explained in order for the assessor to rate accurately, and for the reader to understand the context of exposure. Now, how do we estimate a risk? Risk is equivalent to hazard times exposure. Based on the previous definition of hazard and exposure, we can define risk as the likelihood of harm to occur and the consequences of its occurrence. Risk can be presented in variety of ways to communicate the results of analysis in order to make decision on risk control. In mathematical form, we can summarize the hazard identification and exposure assessment by multiplying the rating value of a hazard to its exposure to give us a numerical value which carries an indication of the severity of a hazard. We call this risk characterization. The purpose of risk characterization is to make assumptions and scientific judgment pertaining to a hazard, and to define significance of an estimated risk. For risk characterization that uses likelihood and severity in its rating, presenting result in a risk matrix is a very effective way of communicating the distribution of the risk throughout a workplace. Risk can be calculated using the equation, risk equals to hazard severity rating, times likelihood of exposure rating. This is an example of a risk matrix table. To use this matrix, first find the severity column that best describes the outcome of risk. Then follow the likelihood row to find the description that best suits the likelihood that the severity will occur. The risk level is given in the box where the row and column meet. You can use this table to see whether a hazard falls in high, medium, or low risk group. Besides risk matrix table, you can use the risk value to prioritize necessary actions to effectively manage workplace hazards. For example, this table determines priority based on the ranges of risk values. Values 1 to 4 are considered low risk, 5 to 12 as medium risk, and 15 to 25 as high risk. If a hazard is assessed as high risk, the workplace must carry out immediate actions to resolve risk to life, safety, and/or the environment. Individuals responsible for required action, including follow-up, must be clearly identified. A further, detailed, risk assessment method, such as quantitative risk assessment, may be required as a mean of determine suitable control measures. It is important to communicate the result of risk assessment to the employer and employees of a workplace. Risk communication is an interactive process of exchange of information and opinion on risks among risk assessors, risk managers, and other interested parties. Communicating risk is a challenging task. It requires both the arts and science of communication under various conditions, scenario, levels of concern, understanding, education level, level of trust, level of company or society hierarchy, and differential interpersonal standing. Risk communication can be either formal or informal. Formal means conveying information in a proper forum such as meeting, training, notices, letters, and so on. Informal means conveying risk via opportunistic chit-chatting or conversation with the employer or employees in all circumstances. At the end of the day, the most important aim in any risk communication is to make understand the risk to the recipient, so that necessary actions can be taken or practiced willingly to achieve reduction in risk. Hazard control is the process of implementing measures to reduce the risk associated with a hazard. It should be carried out according to the priority based on risk assessment. The process of hazard control should follow an established priority order for the types of measures to be used to control risks. The hierarchy of hazard control is elimination, substitution, engineering control, administrative control, and application of personal protective equipment. The hazard should be eliminated first if possible. If it cannot be eliminated, it should be replaced with less hazardous means or materials as far as practicable. Hazard should be controlled at the source where the problem is created by means of applying engineering controls. If this does not work, hazards can often be controlled along the path to the worker, between the source and the worker. This can be achieved by applying engineering control or administrative controls. If this is not possible, then hazards must be controlled at the level of the worker through the use of protective equipment, although this is the least desirable control. Hazard control measures can be implemented in various ways. Before we implement any control measures, we must make sure that the measures that we are going to implement are technological feasible, beneficial financially, acceptable to public, and not against established government policy or legislation. Sometimes, a control measure can be no action at all. It can also be just information sharing, or exposure monitoring. Hirarc process must be properly documented. In the following slide, I am going to show you an example of Hirarc form that can be used for documentation purpose. This form is meant for one work process. A proper and legal documentation of risk assessment result requires official endorsement and acceptance by the employer of a workplace. All risk assessment reports should be kept for at least 3 years. This is an example of a Hirarc form. This form is divided into 4 parts: the basic information, the hazard identification, the risk analysis, and the risk control information. This is an example of how we can fill in a Hirarc form for the risk assessment of a wood panel cutting process. The basic information should contain the name of the company, the name of the assessor, the date of assessment, the name of the process you are accessing, and the location of the process. Under the hazard identification columns, we should describe the work activity and the associated hazard that was identified, together with a simple description of the outcome or severity of this hazard. Under the risk analysis columns, we should include any information on the existing control measures. Then, we have to write down the likelihood of exposure rating and hazard severity rating, and calculate the risk value. Finally, under the risk control columns, we should provide recommended control measures to overcome the risk, as well as the suggested person in charge to implement these control measures. Implementation of hazard control measures must be supported by a systematic monitoring and review process. The effectiveness of controls must be checked regularly. Monitoring can be carried out during inspections, routine maintenance, and other activities. When we carry out monitoring process, we have to consider the following questions. Have the controls solved the problem? Do the controls pose any risk to workers? Are there new hazards identified? Are significant new hazards appropriately controlled? Are accident reports being analyzed? Are any other measures required? Control activities must also be documented to track their effectiveness. If necessary, hazards can be re-evaluated, and new control measures can be implemented. We have talked about hazard identification, exposure assessment, risk characterization, risk communication, hazard control, and control measures monitoring. All of these are collectively known as the risk management cycle. In other words, risk management means the total procedure associated with identifying a hazard, assessing the risk, putting in place control measures, and reviewing the outcomes. Hirarc is a subset of risk management cycle, and it is essential to carry out Hirarc in a proper manner so that the risks can be managed effectively. In summary, hazard identification, risk assessment, and risk control, or commonly known as Hirarc, is a simple method to assess the risk of hazards in the workplace. This method can be used to prioritize the need for immediate control measures to be implemented. It can be done easily and repeatedly by the workers of a company, as it does not require specialized training. Furthermore, it can be used for any form of hazards, making it a robust and commonly acceptable method worldwide. Thank you for your attention.